There can be no doubt the Mormon Battalion, Pueblo Detachment coming into Salt Lake Valley heard Jim Bridger's true story about Echo Canyon. The story went like this. Just before Bridger would retire for the night, he would yell out, "Jim, it's time to get up," then lay down and sleep until the echo awakened him the next morning. Our desire is to reflect a faithful echo of the true stories, service, and conviction of the Mormon Battalion soldiers and the people who traveled with them. While trying to bring clarity to some stories, our intent is not to detract from their accomplishments, but to set the record straight on some myths and misunderstandings that have crept in over the past 175 years. In light of recent research by the Mormon Battalion Association and its friends, let's examine some old saws. This may seem a trivial claim to examine at the outset, but working to understand this seemingly inconsequential mystery led us to original muster rolls and other records not available for research for over 100 years. And that opened the floodgates to some other discoveries. You still see this of Iowa claim on the web and as part of a recent book title. However, all the Army paperwork in 1846 through 47 consistently referred to the Mormon Battalion, as James Allen had named it during its year of enlistment. So, when and how did Iowa get tacked on? Originally, Mormon units were a separate listing on the different page of this 1850 congressional report. In 1877, as part of the effort to get a Mexican War pension approved, this report was rearranged and republished, combining the Mormon units with the Iowa companies. After the pension was appropriated in 1844, General Ainsworth of the Pension Office created the Combined Military Service Record Cards. By the way, when I first went to the National Archives, they told me that was all I needed to see. It was everything. This pre-printed card has Missouri and Iowa volunteers on the title line, identifying the command. There are a lot of secondary and tertiary documents that reference back to the CMSR cards, which are incorrect. After the error came into widespread use, someone pointed out the mistake. The Records and Pension Office decided to edit the entire set to make the corrections. The card has corrections highlighted, or this card has corrections highlighted. Why those have been ignored by modern researchers is odd. Seeing all these crossouts and odd stamps, you'd think would set someone to examining their purpose. In 1911, this letter arrived in the pension office for Samuel Lewis's widow, Sarah. General Ainsworth himself added this terse comment: "This organization is not designated as Iowa Volunteers." So, all of you authors, please stop using the name Mormon Battalion of Iowa. It was just the Mormon Battalion. Note, the Mormon Battalion of Missouri Volunteers is equally as incorrect. When doing research, I always check all three names because different records have been listed different ways. So, that is an error. In discussions with Dragoon historian Tim Kimball about the False Iowa Association, we figured out records should be located in the National Archives and what other documents might be out there. After acquiring photos of nearly all the muster and pay records, we could start serious new work. This table is a matrix of the documents we have used to analyze who was in the battalion. While all the documents haven't been located, there are enough to create a corrected list of participants. One of the other important activities has been the construction of detailed timelines for various specific uses. We could then proceed to answer questions like, not so much a myth as a puzzle, there have been many attempts over the last 150 years to identify the participants. If you go to the Mormon Battalion Association's website, mormonbattalion.com, on the splash page you will see this Correcting the Record link button to Christine Forbes' presentation explaining the process. Click it and you will get 3 files to select from. Choose Building the Roster, Corrected Slides, and you drop into a PowerPoint presentation by Christine Forbes. Since May 2019, Christine Forbes, Marianne Kirk, Tom Brown, and I, with assistance from a few others, have carefully worked through these lists of volunteers. Each of the 15 major published lists has suffered from misidentified men, perpetuated by the CMSR carding. There were men listed as not carried forward on subsequent rolls. People creating the list did not understand this meant that the men did not go. Or, for instance, a Lot Smith on one roll who is missing on the next, but Luther is there, and then Lot comes back on the subsequent roll. The research group has collaborated to analyze those 15 lists against each other, comparing with the primary payrolls, muster rolls, pension, bounty land, applications, and other original documents. With all that primary and secondary information at our hand, the process of identifying, comparing, and sorting of names into correct bins led to some realizations along the way. I have appreciated all the help I have received in this effort, and it's been many people. As of the 31st of August and beyond, we finally get a consistent list of soldiers. So, what does that mean to our understanding of the story? As of the With the detailed timeline, we have insight into the process of raising the battalion not appreciated before. Generally, historians have given the impression that all 5 companies mustered into service on the 16th of July. But that's not correct. You can see why people thought that, though, because all of the records say July 16th. The day they started for Fort Leavenworth, the 4 companies went a short distance. They waited for the 5th company to complete its organization. All 5 proceeded as of the morning of the 22nd, with most of their laundresses and officers' servants. But 3 days after starting for Leavenworth, something happened, which bears more research. Allen allows some of the men to return to get their families and bring them along. These are the families that eventually become the Higgins Family Detachment. Now we have a new question. What prompted the addition of these families to the caravan following the battalion? The command arrives at Fort Leavenworth on August 1st and begins outfitting. Interestingly, Allen backdates almost all of the soldiers' nose counts to the 16th of July. At the end of August, Allen had passed away, leaving Smith to create the monthly muster roll. 5 men not on Allen's roll of August 7th are added and 5 dropped. The count remained the same. The men on the rolls are the men who are officially in the Mormon Battalion. All the horse trading prior to this date didn't stick on the rolls going forward. Drum roll, please. The Army recognizes 496 men as being carried forward on the battalion rolls, and we know each and every name and can finally explain the prior errors. That is not trivial or inconsequential. We can now examine other claims, like Daniel Tyler, in A Concise History of the Mormon Battalion on page 136, repeats what he has been told. The paymaster was much surprised to see every man able to sign his own name to the payroll. Well, that never really rang true, did it? The clothing rolls were the first pay document each man should have signed. By regulation, if a soldier could not sign his own name at the pay table, he made his mark, and a company officer countersigned for the soldier. The percentage of non-signers by company was calculated and this table created. Company B had the highest percentage able to sign, and Company B produced the most contemporary journals. So this is a myth that needs to be footnoted when a future edition of Tyler's book is corrected and annotated. Anyone want to help with that project? Come see us. Now let's examine the history may be searched in vain for an equal march of infantry. Reading Cook's entire congratulatory text suggests he was remarking on how difficult the task had been, but oddly, people have tended to primarily focus on the distance aspect. So let's look at just that. The longest march claim is disputed by some modern historians, but have we seen a clear analysis as a basis for the claim or its denial? Does somebody want to bring me a chair? I think I've been out in the sun too long today, and thank you. Okay, thank you. I am going to sit down because I have been known to faint, so we're not going to let that happen today. Okay, so Kevin Henson constructed a day-by-day table of distances from, thank you, whoops, from their journals. These were averaged, then compared to known landmarks and historic locations. These bookended locations informed about how accurate their estimates were. He then created a day-by-day progress map in Google Earth and used its embedded tools to measure actual distances. These actual distances he included in his timeline spreadsheet and used that to perform some analysis. Here comes some more statistics. The absolute minimum distance was 2,060 miles from Council Bluff to San Diego for the main command's route and sustained march. Dragoon historian Tim Kimball credits Easton's battalion of Missouri volunteers, as traveling further the next year. However, Easton's travels were conducted as 3 separate blocks of travel days with significant breaks between. The Mormon Battalion's progress was a sustained march, broken only by resupply. Perhaps the correct way to phrase the claim would be this: the only longer sustained march we could identify was long after the battalion. It was the modern communist Chinese long march of 3,700 miles, 88 years after the battalion's march. If anyone has another long march candidate in mind, please let Kevin know. The analysis also allows us to comment on the complaint that Lieutenant Smith required forced marches, with 13 miles per day being the historic and modern traditional daily march. We can compare. Allen averaged 15 miles per day for the 11 days down to Leavenworth. Smith, for the 40 out of 41 consecutive days, he averaged 16 3/4 miles, a 25% increase over the daily expectation. Smith's last push into Santa Fe with half the battalion took 5 consecutive days of 20+ miles per day. That with full gear. Ouch. Cook, making the wagon road over more difficult terrain with all his other challenges, averaged 12 3/4 miles per day. So, what do we do with this claim? Since Cook's commendation is a factual synopsis of the march, it is unarguably true. The only item to contend against is the claim he didn't actually make, that it was the longest, but even that seems to be true as of 1847. Oh, I can tell what you're thinking. Lieutenant Smith was described as a slave driver. Dr. Sanderson reportedly tried to kill the men. The Army didn't keep Allen's promises. This was the Army. What do you expect from soldiers other than complaining? However, when you pin their complaints down to specific actions versus how the regular Army and other volunteer units were treated, it becomes clear the battalion was treated no worse, and in some cases treated better than other units. Here are a few examples. Those enlisting later were backdated to the 16th of July for the start of pay. The instructions from Polk was to conciliate them to the nation. Old men and young boys were allowed to enlist. Men too ill to be efficient were given a casual wave of approval from Dr. McIntyre. All of this while under the eye of Allen. When you examine the regulations and journals, you find so many examples where the battalion and the camp followers were treated with kit gloves. Though an ongoing claim woven all through Dan Tyler's text and echoed by subsequent authors, this claim just doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The contemporary journal records reporting discussions with Captain Allen, Brigham Young, and other leaders said they were of the opinion the battalion was unlikely to have battles. Brigham's promise, though, was that none would die by enemy fire. While in California, Cook detached a force of 20 men to El Cajon Pass to deal with local tribesmen who were plundering cattle and attacking ranches. The document, the detachment pursued a small group of tribesmen into the mountains and regrettably killed 6. 2 of the battalion were injured, though not seriously. Consequently, authors ought not exaggerate what Brother Brigham is recorded as actually promising or ignoring what the battalion did. So let's call the no battle claim a myth. Were there 4 or 5 women who went all the way to San Diego? And we had a little bit of interplay with that, with Mrs. Sorensen's. The amount of research that has gone into this question actually boggles my mind. Melissa Correa told us there were 5 women. Cook stated, at the earnest request of 2 captains and 3 sergeants, their wives were permitted to accompany the expedition. We needed a 5th woman who had to be the wife of an officer. So who is our 5th woman? Out of the women who went, Mary Clark Steele Brown had been forgotten. In 1872, in Mary's obituary, it states she was one of the women who accompanied the command 2 battalion men spoke at her funeral. They described her as firm and confident. A final clue, Isaiah, Mary's son, had an affidavit in his pension application from a friend who tells us that during his reenlistment, a rawhide rope parted, one end of which flew back, struck him in the right eye, and cut the eyeball from out of the socket. Ew. He was then conveyed to his mother's home in San Diego, where he was attended. Now, his mother couldn't have a home in San Diego if she weren't the 5th woman. This convinced me Mary was our 5th woman. So, there were 5 women who went all the way to San Diego. By the way, Daniel C. Davis's 5-year-old son also went, and that's something I don't think people realized. It is often said that Brigham took the family's money and spent it on the migration. This subject could be a presentation all by itself. I've done a 50-minute on that. So, this will be Cliff Notes. On the 17th of July, the day after the battalion was official, 88 bishops were called to shepherd the men's families. They were cautioned to keep track of the family's money and their teams, etc. On the 25th of July, 3 powers of attorney that have survived were signed by the officers of companies A, B, and C to the committee. This committee was Newell K. Whitney, Daniel Spencer, and Jonathan H. Hales. Their job was to oversee the finances and supplies for the families. On the 4th of August, Adjutant Dykes says, "We shall draw tomorrow morning $42 per man due for the clothing for the year of 1846, but the most of this will be due Sarpy for the goods received." Now that seems to be a little bit of an exaggeration. So when the men received things at Sarpy, it was an advance against their further pay. Henry Wilcox tells us he had to carry a knapsack of clothing, a blanket, a cup, a knife, a fork, a spoon, a plate, 2-quart canteen, a dinner sack, a musket, a cartridge box, a bayonet, a scabbard, however you say that, 2 other straps, 1 to go on the musket. "When I get all of this on, I am worse fixed up than any horse. I shall not need any other breastwork to defend me." That's in a letter that ended up at the RLDS facility, and so it hasn't been out there, and I think it's great. In his August 6th letter to Ira Bond, Wilcox says, "I have just received $40. I have let my family have $25 to help them off." The records show he sent $20. On August 6, John Taylor collected money at Fort Leavenworth for the families of the battalion men and made the following list. The money was for clothing, as volunteers never got uniforms from the federal government. Another myth busted. So there goes the money. On the 11th, Parley P. Pratt arrived at winter quarters with $5,860 from the men's clothing, close to what was on John Taylor's ledger. All of the money was accounted for with notations of who it came from and who it was going to. George Taggart writes to Fanny, his wife, "I shall send you by the bearer of this letter $20 in money, which I think you must need by this time." Even that amount was accounted for on these ledgers. Here is money listed in the committee records. Note Fanny's signature acknowledging she got the money. In the Army of Israel, the author tells the story of Fanny Taggart as one supporting the idea that Brigham mistreated the women. In Fanny's autobiography, she reports, "I immediately looked up Brother Brigham. He told me to look for some of my acquaintances to get in with them until I could get a house for myself. My husband had written, and we heard part of that letter, stating that some provision would be made for the families of the men. This had kept my hopes up on the way. The answer I received from Brigham made me feel like bursting into tears. To hide them, I quickly turned away. That is where the story fades out in the book. She goes on to say, I walked a few steps and looked up to see a woman standing in the door of a tent. I wiped my eyes and asked if she could direct me to Brother Asa Davis. She'd lived with that family in Nauvoo after her husband left. She showed me his house, and I was given accommodations, such as they had. Much of the money can be accounted for through the records that we have located. We are still doing research into what happened to the money. Kevin just stopped in St. Louis looking for Sarpi's records. Christine Forbes, Tom Brown, and I are working on who got how much money. We expect to soon get the records for the Bishop's storehouse in Winter Quarter, and that should shed some more light. Christine has divided the 287 soldiers' families who sent money into 4 categories. Families who withdrew more than they contributed, 55. And this is probably, the additional money is $10.75, if I remember right. That's about the amount that came in from Santa Fe. So they took not only their clothing money, but also their Santa Fe money. The same amount they contributed were 28 families. Less than they contributed, 117 families, and those who made no withdrawals at all are 86 families. It appears to be a needs-based system that they are using. More research to come in the future. To the best of my knowledge, it is false that Brigham Young misappropriated the money sent back to the Bluffs from either the clothing money or the Santa Fe. Okay, so what are our conclusions? First, let me split a hair, and this is Kevin writing this. If they wrote that something happened, it almost certainly did. What they wrote about it, their interpretation, their feelings, that gets colored by perception. We need to be careful to separate those two concepts. Second, most of the myths are a result of later failures to consult or understand the original information. Our misunderstanding of the journals, failure to consult primary sources, or our inadequate breadth of knowledge seems to be the culprit when we're not.